Hello and welcome to this evening's talk for Equine Health Week. Tonight, I'm joined by Richard Newton from Equine Infectious Disease Surveillance, based at the University of Cambridge. Now, you might have caught Richard's talk last night all about the importance of vaccinating for equine influenza. And if you didn't, it's on our Facebook, or you can find it on our YouTube channel. Tonight, we're back for part two, where Richard will be explaining the importance of 6 monthly vaccinations for flu, which is quite a hot topic at the moment. So Richard, for those of us who maybe missed some of the content yesterday, could you give us a bit of an overview about the risks of flu and how it's transmitted between horses?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks, Rachel, for the second stab at this. So equine influenza, as you would have seen from the talk yesterday, highly infectious viral respiratory disease of horses, and is spread by the horse becoming infected, shedding virus. The horse will be caused to cough, and in that coughing produces a virus, and that goes out into the environment. So there's actually a number of ways that equine flu can transmit between horses, and it's quite efficient when animals have got no immunity against it, and that's particularly if they're not vaccinated. So the act of the horse coughing, any horses in close proximity will become infected. So we have this sort of idea that a horse can directly infect another horse. The thing with flu, unlike things like herpes and strangles, is that can be done over actually quite a distance. So physical separation of only a few meters will stop those other infections, but it won't stop equine influenza. So you need quite a large separation in order for that to be the case. So in groups of animals kept in stables, in yards, they can all become infected quite quickly if they don't have that protection from vaccination. The other thing we have to think about is indirect transmission. So anything that gets contaminated by virus, and we all kind of had to think about this with COVID and the way that surfaces and fomites, as they're called, can move the virus between susceptible animals. And that is true also for equine influenza. And so any equipment can become contaminated, particularly tack, if it's moving between animals without appropriate disinfection. And the other important one is actually to think about people as well, that anybody going to see a horse, maybe a vet examining it, or a farrier dealing with those animals, or other paraprofessionals moving between yards, between horses on yards, they can act as a vehicle for transmitting infection. So it is really important that everybody is aware of that when you've got flu in a yard like that. And our biggest protection, as I say, does tend to be relying on vaccination to stop that. And we know also that these viruses, through both indirect and direct transmission, can move very large distances through transport. And so flu, like human viruses, can actually travel on airplanes and move between continents. So potentially we're talking about really important long distance transmission of these. And we saw that in Australia back in 2007. It was imported with horses from Japan, then broke out of quarantine. Not entirely sure that happened, but it probably did involve humans. And then it spread large distances within Australia as well. So, we do need to think about the ease in which flu will transmit if we haven't got a protected population.
Now, I'm sure many people watching will remember 2019. That's the last time we had a big outbreak of flu in the UK. And as a result of that, the rules around vaccination changed. Could you maybe give us a bit of a reminder of what that happened?
Yeah, well, before 2019, there was a bit of concern that people were a bit confused by the rules that were applied with respect to vaccination around competitions. And we were trying to do a bit of working with both racing and the Olympic disciplines to get them to look at the frequency or the intervals that were being used early in vaccination programs. And the rules that had been introduced in the early 1980s were not quite where the science was telling us we should have those. So we looked to shorten those intervals, certainly between V1 and V2. So shorten that down from 21 from up to 92 days down to 60 days. And the V2 to V3, so that first booster going in, we knew that there was a period of susceptibility before that. So we wanted to shorten that down as well. We were making good progress, and then 2019 came along. And the thing that didn't surprise us, but we hadn't planned on changing, was the annual booster frequency. But 2019 really highlighted the importance of vaccination and the importance of doing vaccination more frequently. So what happened was that the racing jurisdictions were the first people to consider it, as they had with their rules way back in the early 80s. And they have decided to shorten their annual booster frequency down to 6 months. And then hopefully we were hoping that the other disciplines through British Equestrian would follow suit. And indeed they have done, and that's been fantastic. But obviously we've had a vaccine shortage come along, and we've had to look at that, which was not the plan. Nobody wanted that. It was out of our hands. So we've had to look at that and slightly relax things for a short period of time.
And obviously the move to 6 monthly hasn't always been the most popular decision with the equestrian population. Could you maybe explain the logic behind that decision to go from annual to 6 months?
Yes, I mean, it's quite right that people should question that, and they'll know that the long-standing rules of annual vaccination, have largely stood the test of time. But unfortunately, what they maybe aren't aware of is that there are some examples where it hasn't, and we feel from doing more scientific work that we can actually improve things. And what's interesting is if you actually look at the history of this, the FEI quite a number of years ago now actually changed their rules. So all we're really suggesting is that we all fall much more in line with what the FEI did. Their change was again based on science and based on the best advice that the scientists give them, how to keep that competing population of horses, not just the ones going to events, but the ones back on their home premises, how they could keep them best protected against equine influenza. And if you watch the video, you'll see that equine influenza has an effect, can have a very marked effect on the ability to put on equestrian events. And that's where it causes its damage, really. It can stop events happening. And that's what we saw in 2019. We saw racing stop for a few days. We saw other events later in the year adversely affected because of that. So the science and observation from the field is what we've based it on. And the basic understanding of how vaccines work, which I sort of go through in the video, is that we do rely on antibody being stimulated. And that's not an instant thing. You have to go in with several vaccines in order to stimulate optimal antibody levels. And those antibody levels, if you can keep them optimal, will protect horses and they'll protect populations. But the nature of it is that those antibodies will decline with time. They don't last lifelong. They don't stay at a high level lifelong, and therefore they will decline. And we know that animals 12 months after the last vaccination will be more susceptible than an animal that's been vaccinated only 6 months previously. And that really was the rationale behind protecting as quickly as possible and keeping animals protected during that extended outbreak, an epidemic that we saw in 2019. And that's when it was introduced. And indeed, by observing groups of horses, particularly race horses, but they're obviously athletic young animals that have to be performing at a very high level, we know that numerous times in history, not just here, but in other countries as well, we see that those animals that have gone beyond 6 months before their 12-month boosters are due are actually the ones that are found to be infected and have the worst disease when influenza comes in. So based on observations with those outbreaks, we know that there is evidence that if we were vaccinating more frequently, and indeed those papers quite often would recommend that we ought to be doing it more frequently based on the observations that were made with them. What we've also done is we've used something called mathematical modelling, and people would have heard about this with outbreaks like foot and mouth disease good number of years ago, but also more recently with COVID. And the beauty of mathematical modeling is you can actually run simulations of outbreaks and epidemics many tens, hundreds of thousands of times, which we can't do in real life and we don't want to do. We get one shot at it. But by simulating these epidemics, we can look at what the effects of tweaking things like vaccination are. And what that has consistently shown us, and it's kind of common sense, but when you run that at a population level, you really see the benefits of shortening that annual vaccination down to 6 months. And you just provide the whole population with better coverage and protection. And the outbreaks that you see are much smaller and less impactful when you do that. So that kind of backs up what we've seen in the field as well. And the other element that we have to think about is that not all horses will respond the same way to vaccination. Some, will have adverse events and may not respond in the same way. Some of them may be left unvaccinated. And what we do rely on in any population of animals is that the majority of animals that are vaccinated act to protect those that aren't. And that's a phenomenon known as herd immunity. And again, it was very prevalent and talked about in COVID, that we needed to protect the vulnerable, if you like, by everybody getting vaccinated who could get vaccinated. And the same is exactly true with equine influenza. It's been recognised for a long time. And so also by going more frequently, those animals that are at risk of developing influenza, we protect the whole population much better as well. So that sort of concept of herd immunity would benefit as well. And then the final point is that, and we see it with all types of influenza, as we did with COVID, which isn't an influenza virus, but it's an RNA virus, they mutate naturally. And what that means is that in time, as the infections are going through animals, the virus is slightly changing each time, and the vaccines actually get out of date. And when that happens, they're less able to protect animals against whatever is infecting them. And we know that it takes time and money to update equine influenza vaccines. And when decisions are made to do that, it can take years before new vaccines with new strains are coming along. And the way that we can best, protect against that phenomenon is by actually using vaccines strategically in a slightly different way. And one way we do that is by giving them more frequently. So topping up that high level of antibody, which we know if we can keep it at a high level, it will be enough to cross protect against different strains as they emerge. And so it protects us against that phenomenon as well. And again, we see very clear evidence from the field when we look at it that is actually happening. The animals with the highest antibody, most recently vaccinated, are the ones that will not be showing signs and will not be infected and won't be transmitting on to other animals. So there are multiple arguments why vaccinating more frequently, particularly in animals that are going from their home premises, mixing with other animals where there may be infection introduced and then returning home. Those are the animals that we ought to be really protecting with more frequent vaccination. So the scientific community are very comfortable that this is a good thing, and it will act to protect the wider population of horses as well.
Thank you, Richard. That's a very compelling case, I think. Before we wrap up, have you got any other messages for those who are watching on the subject?
Yeah, I mean, we as horse owners, then you love your animals, you want to do the best by them, and I think there is a social obligation to protect their health and welfare as much as is possible. And one simple way of doing that, whether you think the risks of flu today, tomorrow, or in the future are minimal for your animal, one way you can do that is actually to keep it regularly vaccinated. So that if it does come across this infection, it's going to be protected against it, not become infected and then infectious, and act to transmit this on through that chain of transmission that I talked about yesterday. So it's doing your little bit to protect that animal. In the grand scheme of things, I think it's relatively cheap. It allows your vet to come on a regular basis, check over the animal, and you're doing the best, not only for your own animal, but everybody else's as well. So please do consider getting back to regular 6-monthly booster vaccination, and everybody will benefit.
Thank you very much, Richard. And of course, if people have got any questions about this, they can speak to their own vets at home and they'll help them out with it as well. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you tomorrow for more Equine Health Week information.